Welcome back to Beer Brackets, everybody. We're sitting here in the pub, and we're about to open a beer and enjoy ourselves. And nightly beer meditation here. Not nightly, but one night of the week, the beer meditation that we do. There's so many beer topics, my friend, to tackle, right? And there's so many that we've tackled already, and there's so many that we want to talk about. But one that I think is very interesting that came up recently because we did a review of Asahi Super Dry. And so the concept of dry beer came up. And so this is something that I was always curious about when I was young, because I would see, on the beer shelves here in Canada, Molson Dry was a big thing. They even had something called High Dry, which was even more dry than the regular dry. And I was always wondering about it, what is a dry beer? And at the time, I wasn't a beer explorer, so I couldn't place it in my mind and I couldn't picture it. It's sort of like beer's wet. Beer's always wet. I've had many beers. Beer's wet. What is dry? What is it saying when you say a beer is more dry than something else? Now I have a better idea, of course. But for somebody who might be curious as well, who landed on this video, what would you describe as being a dry beer as opposed to a wet beer? Wet
beer. Well, that's a very good question, first of all, because like you were just stating, it's a confusing term to associate with the beverage to begin with. Mm-hmm. It simply refers to something that is lacking sweetness. Mm. So it's kind of like the opposite of
interesting.
Sweet.
Okay.
That's the very broad term. But when it comes to beer,
that's a great way to lay the foundation of this answer, I think.
I think so too,
putting
right?
that out there, yeah.
So if you think like something that is not sweet, you can, instead of saying not sweet, you say dry. So
right.
It is exactly the opposite. When it comes to beer, obviously, there's many different elements that play into what you could call like a beer. And one of them, obviously, is the sweetness, which is usually given to the beer by the malt, the residual sugars that are present that are not being consumed during the brewing process. And therefore,
exactly.
The more of those sugars are there, the more the beer is going to taste sweet. Now,
right.
While that's one element, there's also something else that needs to be taken into consideration, because beer is normally also brewed using hops. And hops, as we all know, are bitter. So hops can very easily mask the sweetness, the maltiness of the beer. So when you have those two elements, and that's what the brewer usually plays with to hide, or to not to hide necessarily, but to deliver a pleasant experience to the drinker.
That's so interesting. And I remember, one thing that I read that was really, for me, explained it really well when you think about fermentation. So it's like anything else. If you're thinking about even like making bread, not even just brewing beer, right? Like you have the yeast, right? And then you have like the sugars that activate the yeast that the yeast feed off of. Right. And then the byproduct is what becomes fermentation. So with the beer, one explanation that I heard that really sort of clarified it for me, because I don't have a very scientific brain when it comes to this. How I view beer and brewing is very much anecdotal, more so than scientific. And you're much more on the scientific side of things. A dry beer is basically a fully fermented beer. So all the sugars, like you said, there's no residual sugars. So all the sugars have been eaten up by the yeast during the fermentation process. And so you have this dry product that's dry on the finish. And that's another thing. The dry aspect refers to the finish of beer. Like even if you say a dry wine, right? It's kind of like there's no residual sweetness that's left on your palate afterwards. So when you say wet, it's like something that coats your palate. It's this sensation or taste that are left over that linger and kind of evolve on your palate afterwards. So it's almost like it's coated with something, hence the wet, right? And then dry being just like a quick, harsh, it's over. It's like a dry hit, like kind of if you think of champagne, right? Like a good champagne, you take a sip, it's kind of like this dry sort of like punch. You get the flavor really quickly on your palate, then it's like gone. And very so that's said. A good way of looking at it. All the sugars have been eaten up, no residual sugars. Cheers, everybody. Let us know down below. You enjoy a dry beer. You enjoy a wet beer. And stay tuned. If you enjoyed this, you can click the playlist on the following screen to check out all the other Inside the Brackets coming up. This is episode 31. We have 30 other ones. So you can learn all about beer and all about the beer world.